This is a second tutorial covering Adobe Flash. In this tutorial, we'll be going through the basics of animation. We're going to go over how to make a classic tween, how to make a motion tween, and finally how to make a shape tween. But before we can animate anything, you're going to need to commit some shortcuts to memory. Two of the shortcuts that you're going to need to know in Flash that you're going to use on a daily basis are F5 and F6. The function keys are at the top of your keyboard, marked with an F from F1 to F12. So F5 is the shortcut to insert a frame, and F6 is the shortcut to insert a keyframe. So when you're making animation in Flash, the keyframes are the starting and the beginning points, and the frames are the points in between, or sometimes referred to in the language of animation as tween frames. Now you have to insert the keyframes, but the computer will insert the in-between frames or the tween frames for you. So let's get started by making a simple classic tween. We're going to have to put in something that we can animate. So I'm going to go to our drawing tools, and I'm just going to get the oval tool, and I'm going to make a circle by holding shift to constrain the oval tool to draw a perfect circle. Now that can be whatever color you want. In my case it's blue with a green stroke. Notice that in my timeline, just through the act of drawing that circle by putting some content on the stage, instead of having a white circle marking the first frame, I now have a black circle marking the first frame. And that's letting me know that I have a keyframe. So that black dot represents a keyframe, and just the act of drawing content on the stage puts in the first keyframe. Now let's say that I want to move this circle, I want to animate it, and I want it to move across the stage from the left side of the stage and stop right on the right side of the stage before it goes out of the frame, or out of the stage. The first thing that I need to decide is how long I want that to take place. So let's say that I want that to take 30 frames. So I can move down to the 30th frame in my timeline and click with my mouse to select that frame, and it should be highlighted blue. Then on my keyboard, I want to hit function 6 to insert a second keyframe. When I insert that second keyframe, what it does is it copies the content from the first keyframe and it places it in the second keyframe, and because I haven't moved it yet, it places it in perfect alignment so you can't tell that there's two copies of that circle. But if I now move that to my end position, I'll have a circle that's in the end position at frame 30, and then if I pull on this little red bar, which is my playhead, I can scrub my playhead. Scrubbing the playhead is just the act of looking at the progress of the animation by dragging the playhead back and forth. So now I have a really simple choppy animation of my circle in frame 1 on the left hand side of the screen, and if I scrub the playhead forward, when I get to frame 30, it jumps to the right hand side of the screen. Now that's not a very effective animation at this point. To make that an effective animation, we need to add the in-between frames, and the computer will do that for us. So to cause the computer to add the in-between frames, select the first frame by clicking it, hold shift on your keyboard, and select the second keyframe by clicking it. Everything should be highlighted blue, which lets me know that everything is selected. And then if I put my mouse anywhere in between the two keyframes and I click and hold, I get the animation menu, which is the most important menu in Flash. And I want to go down to the third option in that menu, which is Create Classic Tween. Whenever I create Classic Tween, a couple of things happen. An arrow appears in my timeline between the two keyframes. That's letting me know that I was successful in making the tween. The other thing that happens is it turns that whole area a light blue. That's the color coding in Flash that lets you know that that area in the timeline currently has a classic tween. Each of the different types of tweens has a different color for coding. Now if I play the animation by grabbing that little red bar that represents the playhead and just dragging back and forth, you can see that the computer has added all the in-between frames, and I now have a much smoother animation. Now if I want to see that in real time, I need to actually play the animation. So to play the animation, you can come up to your control menu and pick the first option, which is play. And so if I play the animation, you'll see that animation in real time. Now let's say that I wanted to make that animation go slower, that I wasn't happy with how fast the animation is going across the screen. I want a much slower progression from left to right. You can place additional tween frames in between the two keyframes, and that will stretch the animation out in terms of time. So right now it's taking about it's taking 3 seconds because I have my frame rate set to 10 and I've made an animation that's 30 frames long. So that's 3 seconds that it's taking the ball to go from one side of the screen to the other. If I want it to take 4 seconds, for example, I could put my cursor in between the two keyframes and then holding function 5, every time I click function 5, it will put in another tween frame, which will stretch down the animation. And so now I've stretched down the animation to 40 frames, and so if I go to control play, it'll take a lot longer to play, or it'll take another second. It'll take 4 seconds to go from one side of the screen to the other instead of 3 seconds. Let's say that I wanted to do the opposite. So if I want to remove time, shift function 5 will remove a frame every time you click it. So let's say that I wanted this to be 2 seconds or 20 frames instead of 40. Well, if I click shift function 5 20 times, it'll take out 20 frames. And so now if we play the animation by going to control play, you can see that it's moving much faster. So if you want something to go slower, insert frames between the keyframes. And if you want something to go faster, remove frames between the two keyframes. So we could make that go faster still by inserting our, just clicking to select a frame between the two keyframes, and then shift function 5 to remove a frame. And if I do that 10 times, I can take this down to 10 frames, which will cause this animation to happen in a second. So if I go to control in my menus and go to play, it's going much faster now. Let's say I wasn't happy with the ending position. I really wanted it to go from the bottom left-hand side diagonally up to the top right-hand side. Well, at any point, you can change the position of your keyframes, which will change the animation. So if I select the second keyframe, I can simply drag my object to a new ending position. And now if you scrub the playhead, you can see that instead of going across the bottom of the screen from left to right, it's now going diagonally across the screen from left to right. Or let's say I wanted to start in a different position. We'll select the first keyframe, select the object, and I could have it start in the top left-hand corner instead of the bottom right, left-hand corner. And now if I scrub the playhead, the animation will move across the top of the screen. Let's say that after I had the animation move across the top of the screen, let's say I wanted it to look as though it bounced off this wall and then bounced back down to the bottom of the screen, right? So I'm going to add another or I'm going to add a direction change, right? And so in order to add a direction change, I need to add another keyframe. So you need to add another keyframe when you're doing something that's a major change. So that could be a change in scale, a change in color, a change in shape. or a change in direction, which is what we're going to do now. And so if I move down, let's say another, let's say to the 30th frame, and I put in another keyframe by hitting function 6 on your keyboard, it copies the previous keyframe and it puts its content in exactly the same position. So with the third keyframe selected, I could move that down and it will look as though the animation moves across from left to right. Okay, so once it gets to the position of the second keyframe, it's then going to move from that position down to the bottom. Let's say that I want it to look like it bounced off the bottom and bounced over here to the left-hand side. Well, I could add another keyframe. So I could come down to the 50th frame, for example, shift function 5 on my keyboard, shift function 6 on my keyboard to put in a new keyframe, and then with that keyframe selected, move it to my new position. So now I have it kind of from position 1, from keyframe 1 to keyframe 2, it moves from left to right at the top of the work area. From keyframe 2 to keyframe 3, it moves down diagonally to the bottom. And then from keyframe 3 to keyframe 4, it moves back over to the right, to the middle. And I could continue that if I wanted to. So I could come down to the 70th frame, click it to select it, put in function 6 to put in a keyframe, and then I could have it move back up to the top left-hand corner, for example. And so if I scrub my playhead back to the beginning, and we go to Control, and I go to Play, you'll have the animation, or you will have made an animation of the ball bouncing around the stage. So Control, Play. So that's an example of how to do a classic tween. Next, we're going to go over how to make a shape tween. To make a shape tween, you're going to need to start with a shape. So I'm going to start by just getting my paintbrush tool, and I'm going to paint just kind of a little blob. Now, it's important with the shape tween not to make shapes that have holes in them, or you'll get a really unusual result. So I'm just going to make kind of just a little blue blob. I'm going to move forward in time as long as I want this transformation to take place. Now let's say that I want it to stay stationary for 2 seconds before it starts making the transformation. So I'm going to go down to the 20th frame, so 10 frames per second is our frame rate, so the 20th frame will be 2 seconds, and I'm going to do a function 6 to put in another keyframe, and I'm not going to do anything. So because I don't do anything from the first keyframe to the second keyframe over the span of the first 20 frames, it'll just stay stationary. Then let's say that I want my animation to take place over the course of the next 20 frames. So I'm going to go down to the 40th frame, and I'm going to put in another keyframe by hitting function 6 on your keyboard. And I'm going to change the object now. So let's say that I just make the object a different shape. I'm going to just kind of elongate it so that it kind of has some arms maybe. Now this could be any shape pretty much. You just want to make sure that you don't have any closed forms. You want it to be a solid shape. That works best for shape tween. So I'm just going to expand it like that. And I don't have an animation yet. But let's say that then I want that to stay that shape for a few seconds. So I'm going to go down to the 60th frame, and I'm going to put in another keyframe. So function 6 on your keyboard. So let's just look at what we have here. So I have my first shape, and it's going to stay the first shape for the first 20 frames. Then from the 20th frame to the 40th frame, it's going to morph into this shape. It's not doing that yet, but it will in a second. And then from the 40th frame to the 60th frame, it's going to stay that shape. So in order to cause this to smooth out, we need to put the tweens in, and the computer will do that for us. So if you select the first frame, hold Shift on your keyboard, select the 60th frame in this case, but usually you want to select the last frame. All of that will become highlighted blue. Click and hold anywhere in between, it doesn't matter where, anywhere in that area that's highlighted blue. And I want to pick the second option in that animation menu that pops up, which is Create Shape Tween. And now if I scrub my playhead, you should see that it stays the shape that it is until it gets to the 20th frame, and then it morphs into this new shape at the 40th frame, and then it stays that new shape until the 60th frame. And so if we want to see this in real time, go back to scrub your playhead back to the first frame, go to your control menu, and go to play. And that is an example of a shape tween. Now we could shape tween that further. So I could come down, say, another 20th frame to the 80th frame and put in a keyframe. And maybe I'll change the color of this object to red. And I'm also going to give it some longer tentacles and maybe some additional tentacles. And I want that to hold once it gets to the point where that animation is finished. So I'm going to go down to the 100th frame, and I'm going to put in another keyframe, function 6. And so if I scrub back and we play this, go to control menu and go to play, you'll see your blue blob morph into a starfish shape, and then that's going to morph into this kind of spidery thing. Notice that the shape tween also lets you morph color from one color to another. And so not only is this changing shape, it's also changing from blue across a progression of, purpley colors until it's finally red. So a shape tween lets you not only tween the shape of an object, but it also lets you tween the color of an object, and you can also do the transparency of an object. If you wanted to change this at any point, like let's just say I decide, I made the tips a little too pointy, right? Well, you could select that keyframe, and I could get the eraser tool, which we haven't talked about yet, right? So pretty straightforward though, as the name implies. It lets you erase things. So I could erase these so that they're not quite so long, and that will change my animation. So now, they don't get quite so long. Now let me show you what happens if you have an enclosed form. So let's go down a little further. I'm going to go down to, say, the 120th frame, and I'm going to put in another keyframe, function 6, and I'm going to get my eraser tool, and let's erase a circle out of the middle of this, or a void out of the middle of this shape. Let me put in one more keyframe so that'll stay stationary at the end. And so now, if you look at this, you get some really bizarre things happening. So Flash doesn't really play too nice with shapes that have a void in them, right? It doesn't really know how to accomplish that void when it's shape tweening. And so it accomplishes it in this case by duplicating the contour and then shrinking the contour down to that shape, which I guess looks kind of interesting, but is kind of distracting as well. And in most cases, you're not going to like that, I don't think. So just be careful. There's only so much that a shape tween can do. There's a lot of cool things that it can do, but in most cases, I think you want to try to avoid this situation where you have a counter or a void in the middle of a shape. But that gives you an introduction to shape tweens, and next we're going to be talking about the motion tween function. So now I'm going to talk about how to make a motion tween using Flash. And again, I'm going to start with just a circle. Now in this case, I'm going to delete the stroke off so that we just have a filled circle. You can do some of the same things with a motion tween that you can do with a classic tween. But one of the major advantages of a motion tween over a classic tween is that you can animate something on a path. So say an arch, for example. And with a classic tween, you can only animate things along straight lines. So I'm going to demonstrate how to animate the circle along a straight line. That's going to look really similar to what we did previously with the classic tween. But then I'm going to show you how to alter that so that it goes along a more complicated path. So we're going to start with a circle. And again, that's going to automatically put a keyframe in. I'm going to move down in my timeline as long as I want this to take. So let's say I want it to take 3 seconds. So I'm going to go to the 30th frame, and I'm going to hit function 6 to put in another keyframe. Oh, actually, I'm doing this wrong. Let me undo that, Control Z. The process of doing a motion tween is a little bit different than a classic tween. So with a classic tween or a shape tween, you need to start with 2 keyframes before you put on the tween. But with a motion tween, you start with 1 keyframe, you click that keyframe and click and hold until you get your animation menu, and you pick the first option, which is create motion tween. It's going to ask me if I want to make the selected object a symbol. And the thing about a motion tween is a motion tween can only be applied to a symbol. So you're always going to want to hit OK on this. Now, we haven't talked about what symbols are yet, so it may not make sense completely what you're doing, but we will get to this in a future tutorial. But for now, just go ahead and hit OK on that. I do want you to notice, though, that it put a box around it, which is the visual cue in Flash that lets me know that that's a symbol. So it automatically converted it to a symbol for me. And so now if you click that object and you drag it to its end position, Flash will go ahead and put in the tween frames for you. And it's going to put the tween frames in a straight line. And you're going to get these little points along the line, which you can manipulate to make, say, an arch. So if I grab one of those points and I pull up, for example, when I release the mouse, it's going to redraw that line so that it's now an arch. And my animation will follow that line. Notice that Flash automatically put your second keyframe in for you as well. Now, if you wanted that to take more time, because it just defaults to 10, and I'm not sure why it defaults to 10, it's just kind of the magic number. I'm sure there's a setting in the properties somewhere where you can change that. But if you want that to take more time, so you want that ball or that circle to take more than a second, you can always just put your, just select between the 2 keyframes and function 5 to put more frames in. So now it's 20, so it'll take twice as long to navigate that arch. Let's say I wasn't happy with where the end point was. You can always select the path. So I could select this end point and I could move it back, Or I could select one of these other points and I could give it less of an arch. And so now that animation will go along that new path. Now let's say that I wanted it to go and kind of bounce and then hop back up again, right? So that I make kind of a really sharp change in direction on my path. To do something like that, I will really need another keyframe. So I can come down, let's say, to the 40th frame and hit function 6. And with that keyframe still selected, which it will be selected by default, move your ball to another endpoint. And when you do this, it's going to kind of mess up your path, and so you may have to correct some things. If you grab the path, you might complicate things. But instead, if you grab the object, right, you might find that easier to get your path back into the position that you want. But I now have, this kind of 2 hops, right? So if I move this, just by scrubbing the playhead, you can see that the ball kind of hops along. If I wanted to put a third hop, I could come down, so say to frame 65, put in another keyframe, function 6, and by moving the ball, or alternately moving the ball and moving my path, I could get it into another hop. So this isn't perfect at this point. It kind of goes a little back at that second hop. Let me move that. Let me see if I can get that a little better. So then if we scrub our playhead back to frame 1 and we go to our control menu and I go to play, you'll have this hopping along. Now just for your information, in the final animation that path will not be shown. So this is just for your visual reference while you're working. But when we output this final animation, you won't see this path that it's moving along. So if I wasn't happy with how that was hopping, I thought it was hopping too slow, which I do think it's hopping too slow, I'd like for it to be a little speedier, you can always put your playhead in between 2 keyframes and do a shift function 5. Ooh, sorry about that. And do a shift function 5, and it should take frames out. So if I take some frames out in between each of these keyframes, it will shorten the amount of time between each keyframes. So shortening the number of frames shortens the time, which causes the animation to go faster. And so if I look at this now, if we put it back to frame 1, and I go to my control menu and I go to play, it'll go really fast. So that's the basics of animation. I guess the one thing that I haven't covered is how to remove frames. So if you want to remove a frame or a keyframe, you can select the keyframe that you want to remove, for example. And if you click and hold, you'll get your animation menu. And you could go down to clear keyframe. And I could clear different types of animation. So in this case we did position, and that will clear out that last keyframe. Or if I wanted to remove in between frames, I could click and hold, and I could just go to remove frames. And in this case I removed all the frames because I had them all selected. Let me undo that, Command Z. If I just want to remove one frame, don't have all of them selected, you can also remove the whole tween. So with the whole tween selected, I could go to remove tween, and then that will break off the entire tween, and I'll just have that ball sitting there. So that's the basics of animation, and that's all for today.